Good afternoon, everyone. How are y'all doing? What's the, sitting in the first couple of rows is, gotta be careful about that, huh?
We have a rule against it.
A rule against it, yeah. Well, let me begin just by saying what a pleasure it is to be back here at the Maxwell School. As John said, I studied here 30 years ago. And I should say that for me and my family was the best of times and the worst of times. I had a wonderful experience at the Maxwell School, but while I was here, one of my three daughters was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, and we had to leave here very abruptly to move back to New York City, where she was treated and miraculously and thankfully cured. But I found that this institution was incredibly supportive of me and my family, and I will be forever indebted to the Maxwell School for helping us through a really difficult time. As John said, I'm the Associate Director of the Worker Institute at Cornell. The Worker Institute focuses on promoting workers' rights and collective representation. We believe that in order for us to have a democratic society and a fair economy, workers need to be organized and have a seat at the table. We focus our work on training, education, leadership development, research, technical assistance, a broad range of activities where we have an opportunity to engage with leaders in the labor movement, both in New York and across the country. As John said, I'm a union electrician by trade. I'm a labor educator by profession, and I'm a trade unionist by conviction, and that will inform everything that I share with you this afternoon. There's really like 5 things that I want to address under this title of the labor movement in the age of Trump. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to sort of move through my presentation with enough time for us to have a robust conversation about some of the issues that I raise. So first, I just want to talk about the crisis that the labor movement is facing today, the nature of that crisis. Second, I just want to talk about the issue and problem of rising inequality and the ways in which I think it shaped the context for the 2016 election. Third, I want to talk about labor and its relationship to the American dream, which I think is very much connected to the experience that we just went through. And 4, I just want to expose, to the extent I can, the false promise of what some refer to as Trump populism. And then conclude with a discussion with you about labor's challenges and prospects in the age of Trump. You should feel free during the course of my presentation to raise any questions that you have. You don't have to wait till I'm finished. But we will reserve enough time for us to really get into a conversation about this political moment that we're facing. I also see folks are taking notes. That's so quaint. Taking notes. But I can actually provide copies of these slides to John, and if that's helpful, if you'd like to get copies, you're welcome to them. So he and I can work that out. So let me just start with the first question, and that is, does labor face a crisis today? And I think after several decades of declining unionization, unrelenting assaults on worker rights, the erosion of collective bargaining strength, diminished political influence, many labor leaders today think that the movement faces a significant crisis. But I just want to start by saying I don't think that crisis started with Trump's election. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. For example, just take a look at this quote. Our basic system of workplace representation is failing to meet the needs of America's workers by every critical measure. Our basic system of workplace representation is failing to meet the needs of America's workers by every critical measure. That's a pretty harsh judgment on the state of the labor movement. And you may wonder, who passed that judgment? Is it some brainiac at the Maxwell School or Cornell University? But actually, this is the president of the AFL-CIO, Rich Trumka, who's reflecting on the movement that he leads and is passing a pretty harsh judgment. And it's understandable why he would. Since 1979, the labor movement has lost about 200,000 members every year. And in the last couple of years, 400,000 or 500,000 members. Since 1979, over half of the private sector workers who were in unions are no longer in the House of Labor today. Unions represent less than 11% of the American workforce and less than 7% in the private sector. We see declining unionization in every sector of our economy. New York State is the second most densely unionized state in the country, with just over 22 or 23% of our workforce unionized. Hawaii is the number one state in terms of unionization. But that level of unionization, 22%, was the level of unionization in Tennessee in 1950. So it gives you a sense of how significant and profound that decline has been. And the decline, in particular, in union representation in the private sector means that it's that much more difficult to maintain a unionized public sector, because private sector workers are reluctant to pay for the wages and benefits that public sector workers enjoy when they aren't winning those same benefits and enjoying the same wages within the private sector. And so, part of the story is really understanding what's happening with public sector unions. In 1959, when Wisconsin passed the first comprehensive law allowing public sector workers to organize and engage in collective bargaining, that's the first state with public sector bargaining, over 40% of the private sector workers in Wisconsin at the time were members of unions. In 2011, when Governor Walker gutted that historic law and eliminated the right of public sector workers to bargain in Wisconsin, the level of unionization in the private and public sector combined in Wisconsin was just under 7%. So the process of decline is dramatic. And after Wisconsin fell, then Michigan and Indiana followed with the passage of right-to-work laws. How many of you are familiar with right-to-work laws? So a right-to-work law essentially eliminates a level of security that unions have, where workers who are employed at a place that has a union contract are required to pay the union a fee for the service of collective bargaining. And that comes with a requirement that the unions have to represent all of the workers at that workplace. And right-to-work laws have been passed in almost 30 states, which allows workers to be like freeloaders. They can work at a unionized facility, but not pay for any of the services of the union. It inevitably leads to significant declines in union membership. It's one of many attacks on unions. And on the national stage, in the age of Trump, it's very likely that we're going to see the further proliferation of right-to-work laws, including potentially the elimination of any kind of union security for public sector unions. Unions kind of dodged the bullet when Justice Scalia died. There was a case before the Supreme Court called the Friedrichs case, which would have been decided against unions and would have really decimated public sector unions. But it's very likely in the next 4 years that another case called the Janus case will come before the Supreme Court, and I'll have equally catastrophic impacts on public sector unions. Like, here's the bottom line when I take a look at where the labor movement is at today. The labor movement spends billions of dollars a year on a system of union representation that involves negotiating contracts, filing grievances, representing workers at unionized workplaces. It's a system that billions of dollars are invested into, and it works less and less well for the 15 million union members in the United States, who represent a shrinking share of the workforce. And that whole system is almost entirely inaccessible and largely irrelevant to 90% of the workers in this country. So that's a pretty harsh kind of view of where the labor movement is at today, but I think it does in fact capture this moment. And therefore, I don't think the question is that the labor movement face a crisis, but rather how might the labor movement respond to the crisis that it currently faces. And there are a significant number of union leaders in this country who have the kind of sensibility that comes from the Chinese character for crisis, which is Wei Ji, which is comprised of two characters. One is Wei, meaning danger, and the other is Ji, meaning opportunity. And so there are leaders today who are looking at the crisis facing the labor movement and thinking very carefully about how they can withstand the dangers, but also recognize and seize the opportunities. I'm going to talk some about that. But I start this conversation just being clear that this is a moment of both grave peril and great possibility for the American labor movement. What I'd like to do is just briefly identify some of those dangers and opportunities, and I will return to these at the conclusion of the presentation, which hopefully will tee up the conversation that we might have. So there are many dangers. There are many opportunities. I'm just going to identify 3 of each. So first, among the dangers is that the unrelenting assault on unions that has been going on for several decades is very likely to accelerate and intensify during the Trump administration. There are going to be more and more direct attacks on basic workers' rights, including the right to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. It's likely that there will be lax enforcement of existing labor regulations, so labor standards are likely to be undermined in significant ways. I'll come back to the Department of Labor a little later in the conversation. But the first danger is just that the attacks on unions are going to intensify during this period. The second, I think, is a more complex kind of danger, and it's this, that the politics of anger and resentment that characterized the 2016 election and drew significant numbers of white union members into Trump's orbit has chastened a lot of union leaders. And it has kind of encouraged them to turn inward, to kind of circle the wagons in a way, and to abandon some of the recent and exciting efforts on the part of the labor movement to reach out and engage with other progressive social movements like Black Lives Matter, like immigrant rights, like climate change. And so there's a little bit of a potential response in this moment of leaders becoming more risk averse, less likely to engage with others, which is precisely the wrong response at a time when labor needs all the allies that it can get. That's, I think, the second danger. The third danger is that the underlying differences in the labor movement about how to respond to Trump, as well as differences on other substantive issues like climate change, like racial justice, et cetera, could precipitate a split in the labor movement. And that would come at a time when unity is more important than ever. So these are 3 key dangers, I think, that the labor movement confronts in the age of Trump. But there are also significant opportunities. The first of which is that Trump's election has clearly shifted the social movement landscape as diverse groups and millions of people have engaged in all kinds of forms of resistance, starting with the phenomenal women's marches right after the inauguration across the country, the largest marches or demonstrations that we've had in a generation. And if labor can effectively connect with those efforts of others who are struggling to protect civil society in the age of Trump, then I think there's an opportunity for unions to be quite energized by this emerging resistance that we see. The second opportunity is that rather than succumbing to the vulgar politics of fear and anger that Trump rode to victory, labor could respond to the legitimate anxiety and frustration of the working class by reclaiming and restoring the American dream as a unifying and uplifting and inspiring vision and reality. And I'll talk more about the American dream and its relationship to the labor movement momentarily. So the second opportunity is for the labor movement, rather than becoming more narrow in its focus, but to become broader in its focus. And the third opportunity of this moment is, to the extent that labor can connect with and tap into and help lead this emerging resistance movement, they could help, unions could help to build a wave of energy that they could ride to expanded organizing and revitalized labor movement. The labor movement represents the best resourced, membership-based social force in this country. And a key question for labor leaders is whether or not labor will stand on the sidelines or jump into the fray and really help build this movement. And let me say, just reflecting back on my study of labor history, there has never been a time when the labor movement has experienced significant growth outside the context of a broad social movement. And so this is a particularly important question that labor faces. Let me pause there for a moment. Any questions, or shall I continue? Hearing no questions, I will continue. So let me just make a few observations about the 2016 election, and in particular, the context of that election. The first is that rising inequality is a serious problem that contributes to a politics of division in America. I think it's important for us to recognize that the political, economic, and social crisis that was precipitated by the 2008 crash accelerated and exposed the problem of inequality. And I don't think that we have fully recovered from that crisis. That's the first point I would make, that rising inequality is a problem, and it really sets the context for the kind of politics of anger and division that we have just experienced. The second observation I would make is that rising inequality has eroded the power of the American dream as a unifying vision in our society. Inequality has fractured new fault lines in our nation and created the conditions for the viral politics of fear and resentment that were very expertly and opportunistically stoked by Donald Trump. And the third point I would make is that it is the labor movement that has been the principal force to effectively fight inequality in this country. And the problem for us is that declining unionization and rising inequality go hand in hand. So there's a relationship between the crisis that I described in the labor movement and the problem of rising inequality and the kind of politics that we are experiencing in our country today. As Professor Neil Gross observed, and I quote, "Union decline has left the working class politically and economically vulnerable, and it's this vulnerability that Trump has been able to exploit." So, first argument I'm making is that I don't think you can fully understand and appreciate what we just went through without coming to terms with the problem of rising inequality and its relationship to the decline of the power and presence of unions in our economy and society. So let me just talk for a minute about this problem of rising inequality. I'm just going to focus for the moment on inequality of income. And here we've tried to create a single chart that captures the trends. So what you're going to be looking at here is the percent share of income growth received by the top 10% and the bottom 90% in every post-war, post-recession recovery. So, for example, the first post-war, post-recession recovery was recovering from 49 to 53, and 80% of the income gains or growth went to the bottom 90%, and just 20% of the income gains went to the top 10%. So take a look at what each post-war, post-recession recovery looked like in terms of the distribution of income. Ouch, that's the right response. So let's just be clear. We have experienced a massive redistribution of wealth to the top of the economic ladder. And let me be clear, this is only looking at income inequality. There are many other dimensions of inequality. Racial inequality, inequality of wealth, of power, of health, of opportunity. The problem of inequality is very profound, and it's becoming more and more severe. And I would argue that this is the underlying problem that the labor movement needs to address. So while I think it's important for unions to organize new members, to increase the level of unionization in this country, to negotiate collective bargaining agreements, to defend the gains that they win, to protect their members, at the end of the day, I would argue that we should judge the success of the American labor movement on how effectively it can move the dial on inequality. And that's a big challenge before us. So earlier I said that rising inequality has eroded the power of the American dream as a unifying vision in our society. And interestingly, many social movements in the 20th century have invoked the American dream as a source of inspiration, as a powerful idea that kind of animated those movements. So, for example, in his magnificent I Have a Dream speech in 1963, Martin Luther King said, "I say to you, my friends, I still have a dream. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." This notion of the American dream is a powerful one, and one that has been integrated into many social movements in the 20th century. And so it just raises a question, and this is not merely a rhetorical question, because I've been conducting an unscientific survey with literally thousands of people across the country, just asking this question, like, what is the American dream? Like, when I ask you, what is the American dream, what comes to mind? This is where, like, you got to say something, you know, I've been doing all the talking here. A good job? What else does the American dream? Stop for a minute, think about it. Like, what does the American dream mean to you? Happiness. Interesting. Health? Yeah.
I think of it more like sexist.
As,
Like sexist. Like the woman's like in the house, but like husband's out working.
and that's like your picture of the American dream.
I guess the idea of a level playing field.
The idea of a level playing field, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like something our parents had that we didn't,
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm sorry to inform you, but to the extent that we think of the American dream as each generation will have a better standard of living and quality of life than the previous generation, you are the first generation where that is not true in American history. Doesn't mean you won't, but that's not the expectation. There's another, and yeah.
Social mobility.
Social mobility, that you're not like stuck in a place. Anybody else? Yeah. Stable housing. Stable housing. Yeah. So let me say, like, the American dream means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And sometimes it's like something great, and sometimes it's like I see it in a way that's entirely sexist. I'm not really interested in pursuing that dream. So I don't think it's one thing. I think the American dream means different things to different people, and sometimes different things to the same people at different times in their lives. I would suggest that the American dream has meant like two dreams that are kind of integrally connected to one another, bound together. And one is the dream of wealth and prosperity, and the other is the dream of freedom and democracy. And by wealth and prosperity, I mean more than like the myth of Horatio Alger or Andrew Carnegie, the idea, although, you know, people, one of you mentioned like social mobility as an essential part of this, but the idea that, you know, because that's like a myth, if you work really hard, you can become a millionaire, and plenty of people did in this country. But more importantly, the idea that if you work hard, this country offered the very real possibility of material well-being and security. The idea that, you know, you could work hard, enjoy a decent standard of living, and in particular in relation to the generational issue, I think it was really tied to the notion that you have a reasonable expectation of rising standards of living from one generation to the next. And by the dream of freedom and democracy, to me, this is about an escape from tyranny, whether it's the tyranny that my grandparents endured in Eastern Europe as Jews, or that Black Africans endured in the South, like coming north in the Great Migration. But the idea that there was a real opportunity to become an active, self-governing citizen. And I'd suggest to you that the labor, however you may define it, and to whatever extent this kind of captures at least the way I think of the American dream, I would suggest that the labor movement has played a critical role in making this dream imaginable, not necessarily that people have achieved it, but imaginable in this country. And so I want to explore that a little bit with you, because I think there's a relationship between declining unionization, rising inequality, and the erosion of this idea of the American dream as a unifying idea. So I'm going to present a chart here that will require your interpretation that speaks to this notion of material well-being. And what I'm going to be projecting on this chart, let me be clear, are trend lines. So I don't have all the data points, but I have the trend lines, which will make it a little easier to see. And the first trend line is productivity in our economy. And what do you think that trend line looks like? This is like from 1930 to the present. Yeah, it's a steady increase. And in fact, this kind of misses it because as new technology is introduced into the economy, productivity is growing at an accelerating and in some cases exponential rate. But it's a pretty steady rise. So the next is average wages. And what do you think that looks like? It's also okay to just guess at what it might look like.
Pretty flat.
It's not that it's flat. It rises in parallel to rising productivity, and then in the 70s, it flatlines. All right? Okay. And then the last trend line that I'll project is union density. And by that I mean the percentage of workers in the economy who are members of unions. So what do you think that looks like? Not quite, but you're on the right track. It rises very dramatically from the 1930s into the 1950s. And let me just pause to reinforce the point I made before. This was a period of exponential or explosive growth in the labor movement in the context of a social movement that swept up every fair-minded person across industries, across cities. It was a period of time when union membership more than doubled in a single decade. But then it kind of flatlines in the immediate post-war period, and then it continues to decline. So here's the point I want to make about this dream of wealth and democracy in relation to the labor movement. And that is when we look at American history and we want to see, well, when did average workers experience rising living standards? What was the period of time when the increase in wages was most dramatic? It turns out that it is in this period from 1950 to 1960, which is the only time in all of American history, the only decade in all of American history, when over 30% of the workforce was unionized. So these two coincide. The only period when over 30% of the workforce is unionized is precisely the period when the American dream of wealth and prosperity, meaning living standards, rise most dramatically. So why do you think that is? And pure coincidence is like a potential answer, although here at Maxwell, we wouldn't go for coincidence. We should expect some explanation. So, why do you think that is? I mean, I can understand why union members' wages would rise because they were enjoying the direct benefits of union representation and collective bargaining. But that's not what this graph shows. This shows all workers, union and non-union alike, experienced the most dramatic and sustained rise in wages when over 30% of the workforce is unionized. Take a crack at it. Why would that be?
Unions put upward pressure on the rest of the economy.
Say it again.
Unionized workers, their good wages put pressure upwards.
Exactly right. Exactly right. When over 30% of the workforce is organized, if you just imagine these three folks are neighbors, okay? And that means 1 out of 3 workers is in a union, all right? Your name? Hilda? So Hilda is in a union. She is enjoying the direct benefits of union representation and collective bargaining. She's enjoying rising wages, and her 2 neighbors are talking, over the fence, and they know how well she's doing as a union member. As a non-union employer, why would I feel that upward pressure? Why would I feel compelled to raise the wages of non-union workers when 1 in 3 workers is in a union?
They want workers as higher.
Yeah, so there's 2 reasons. Like, one is in order to attract and retain workers, I got to pay something close to what the union's paying. Otherwise, everyone's going to go work for the unionized employers. And what's the other reason? If they're working in a non-union facility and they're not enjoying the benefits of union representation, what do you think they might want? The union. The union. So the point I want to make here is that when there's kind of a threshold, and it turns out it's about 30%, when you have over 30% of the economy unionized, then unions are setting a standard, and it's a class a rising tide raising most ships in the harbor. And once unionization declines below that 30% threshold, as you see here, whoa, what did I just do?
Happens all the time.
So it says resume slideshow. Imagine. Thank you. What was I saying before I got? Yeah, and once unionization then declines below 30%, and there's a lag factor here. You see wages kind of stagnating. And that's the story of the American economy in the period from the 70s on, has been wage stagnation. Let me digress for a moment to make a few points about this. This period of time is often regarded as like the heyday of collective bargaining in this country, when a significant percentage of the workforce was unionized, rising tide raising all ships in the harbor. But let me be clear about a few things about this. Number one, large regions of the country, including the South and the Southwest, were largely excluded from the heyday of collective bargaining. Workers were not effectively unionized there, largely but not exclusively because significant segments of the working class were excluded from the legal right to organize, which was established in 1935 with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, which allowed private sector workers to engage in collective bargaining. That gave the legal right to work for workers to organize. Who was excluded explicitly in the Act? Domestic workers, agricultural workers, public sector workers, all sectors of the economy where large numbers of workers of color were employed. So the most critical piece of legislation that established the right to organize and led to the proliferation of collective bargaining in this country was passed in a compromise. FDR was president with the segregationists in the South, who insisted that they would support this New Deal legislation so long as it excluded workers of color, because they didn't want this legislation and the right to organize to disrupt the segregationist system in the South. So I want to just point out that part of this whole story that I'm sharing is a racialized story. It's not experienced in the same way for white workers and workers of color. And that's of great significance when we get to the election today. Let's look for a minute at the dream of freedom and democracy. Now here's a graph that may be a little bit more difficult to interpret. What you have on the x-axis is the probability of someone protesting, voting, or participating in an organization. Okay? The likelihood that someone will protest, vote, or participate in an organization. This we use as a proxy for active citizenship. Okay? And the x-axis is the level or years of education that that person has. So what would you guess is the impact of increasing years of education on the likelihood that someone will protest, vote, join an organization? You're thinking that it would go up. And that's exactly right. For citizens who aren't in unions, this is everyone else, we're not talking about the labor movement right now, increased levels of education increase the likelihood that someone will be an active citizen. All right? It's one of the reasons why public education is so important. It's one of the reasons why the attacks on public education today are so menacing. And it's one of the reasons why the labor movement has supported public education from the start. There's a recognition that the more educated people are, the more likely are that they're going to participate as active citizens. Now, to track the same relationship for union members, what do you think that graph looks like? So what you see is that it is true for both non-union and union citizens that increasing the level of education increases the likelihood that they'll be active citizens. But for union members at every level of education, the likelihood that they will protest, vote, join an organization, be active citizens is higher. Why do you suppose that's true? And the sociological data is pretty convincing about this. Why do you think that would be? A guess? Well, here's the answer. One of the essential activities that unions engage in is educating their members, encouraging them to register to vote, encouraging them to vote, encouraging them to engage in protest. The evidence is overwhelming that when you increase the levels of unionization, you increase the level of participation in our democracy. There's a relationship between rising levels of unionization and a more robust and dynamic democracy. So unions have played a key role in both pursuing the dream of wealth and prosperity and the dream of freedom and democracy. So what's happening to the American dream today? Well, I would say for the 1%, using the very imprecise but powerful language of Occupy Wall Street, and I tip my hat to the ways in which Occupy changed the public discourse on this very question. For the top 1%, the dream of wealth and prosperity is very real indeed. The top 1% increased its income by 275% since 1979. The 5 Walton heirs, you know who they are? That's Walmart, the family that owns Walmart. They command the wealth of almost $70 billion. That equals the wealth of the bottom 30% of the society. The 400 wealthiest Americans earned $97,000 a year, an hour last year. 95% of all economic gains since the recovery have gone to the top 1%. The income gap between the top 1% and the bottom 99% has tripled in the last decade. So this reinforces the view that people have that the system is rigged. But the dream of wealth and prosperity for the 99% is slipping away. 90% of Americans lost real income since 1973. The middle class lost 38% of its wealth since the crash of 2008. $10 trillion in personal wealth was lost by the 99%. Student debt, something that may be relevant to some of you in this room, is now over $1 trillion. There are 46 million Americans, 1 in 7, living in poverty, and 1 in 5 children living in poverty in what is the richest country in the world. These trends heighten workers' sense of anxiety and anger and frustration. These trends establish the context for what it was that we experienced in the 2016 election. And it's not just the dream of wealth and prosperity that's slipping away. I would also argue that the dream of freedom and democracy is at risk. And in fact, it's important to recognize that the dream of wealth and prosperity and the dream of freedom and democracy are very much connected, because the concentration of economic wealth inevitably leads to the concentration of political power. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, just remember the golden rule. Whoever owns the gold rules. And that's what we see increasingly. As the great American jurist Louis Brandeis said, "We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." There's no question that money is increasingly corrupting the political process in this country and undermining our democracy. It's a problem that was exacerbated by the Citizens United case, which really opened the doors for unrestricted political contributions by the rich to shape elections. And the power of dark money is only going to get worse during the Trump administration. You should read Jane Mayer's recent book called Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. It is a wake-up call for every patriot who loves this country to think about what's happening with this dark money. And in relation to the dream of freedom and democracy, without a shred of credible evidence of voter fraud, there is this coordinated attack on voting rights at every level, at the local level, the state level, and now likely at the federal level, rolling back the rights of voters that was won through many decades of struggle. And with Jeff Sessions in the Department of Justice, that problem is only going to get worse. So, I would say I only hope that our traditions and institutions of democracy are strong enough to withstand the assault of what I believe is an authoritarian regime that has come to power. And I just want to talk a little bit about that before we close and open it up to questions, to just talk about this politics of division that Trump represents. Because I don't think that we can fully understand the threat of Trumpism without reminding ourselves of the power of the American dream in our political imagination, and the fact that many, many people feel like that dream is slipping away, that they feel like the system is rigged so that that dream delivers its benefits only to a select few, while millions of Americans are left out and left behind. I think that's the sentiment that's out there coming out of this past decade. And it's the erosion of the American dream, as I've described, that I think increases a sense of loss and anxiety and frustration and resentment and anger, especially among many white workers. I think one of the most insightful analysts of the 2016 election is George Saunders, who wrote a great piece called Trump Days, Up Close with the Candidate and His Crowds. And in this essay, he explores the underlying cause of the disaffection Trump supporters felt, and still perhaps feel, and their attraction to his toxic politics of division and resentment. He wrote, and I quote, "What unites these Trump supporters is what I came to think of as usurpation anxiety syndrome. Usurpation anxiety syndrome, the feeling that one is or is about to be scooped, overrun, or taken advantage of by others with questionable intentions. In some cases, this has a racial basis, and usurpation anxiety grades into racial nostalgia, which can grade into outright racism, albeit cloaked in disclaimer." The idea of racial nostalgia, I think, really captures the brilliance and the danger of the Make America Great Again slogan. It's fundamentally about nostalgia, and for many people it's like not Make America Great Again, it's like Make America White Again. Make America like it was when the American dream was real for me and my people. It's to me, frightening how powerful that was. And this syndrome flows from feelings of loss, of frustration, of anger, that inevitably rise in a system that is rigged and doesn't work for workers, and in particular for workers who are open to scapegoating. Someone else is responsible for my frustration and feeling of loss. And many of those workers were offered no alternative in the 2016 election after Bernie Sanders ended his primary bid. These folks that I'm talking about are suffering. Like, I think it's important to recognize that there are legitimate concerns among the white working class in this country. The only demographic group that has experienced a drop in life expectancy, primarily because of diseases of despair, of drug addiction, of alcoholism, of suicide, of other mental illnesses. And I would suggest that they were and continue to be vulnerable to the false promise of Trump's populism. I am moving towards conclusion here. On January 20th, when Trump delivered his inaugural address, he conveyed the populist message that characterized his campaign and contributed to his electoral college victory. He railed against the political establishment that for too long has reaped the rewards of government while people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, he proclaimed, but the people did not share in its wealth. So as we have watched him assemble this elite cabinet of billionaires and millionaires, the richest cabinet in history, a cabinet that resembles a Wall Street executive retreat, few nominations, I would argue, more clearly exposed the false promise of this fake populism than his first nominee for Secretary of Labor, Andrew Puzder. I won't get deeply into who he was, but a careful examination of his record as the CEO of CKE Restaurants, which is the parent company of Carl Jr.'s and Hardee's fast food chains, revealed how fundamentally unsuited he was to lead the Department of Labor. Like every law and regulation that the Department of Labor is responsible for enforcing, he broke as a CEO. His business model was how to rip workers off. And the mission of the Department of Labor is to protect the interests of American workers. I mean, this was one of many examples of Trump finding the slyest fox to guard the chicken coop. And, I would say that given Trump's other cabinet picks, it wasn't surprising that he nominated someone like Andrew Puzder to lead the Department of Labor. But it was very sadly ironic, in a way, because there are many factors, certainly, that can explain Trump's Electoral College victory. We can talk about them in the discussion. But clearly one factor that was central and related to this discussion that we're talking about was Trump's very clever populist appeal to disaffected white workers who've been displaced by globalization, disappointed by an economic system that has left them behind, and exasperated by a political system that they regard as rigged. Had Puzder been placed as the Secretary of Labor, these workers who supported Trump, and many millions more, would have felt the sting of Trump's faux populism and the hypocrisy of his false promises. Fortunately, the labor movement joined a nationwide effort to derail his nomination, and it was a successful effort. But that experience, I think, offers some insight into how labor might respond to this moment that they face in the age of Trump. So let me conclude by just reminding you of the three dangers that I see in this moment, as well as the three opportunities of this moment, and then open it up for some discussion, either about them or about any other questions that you might have. So again, when it comes to the challenges or dangers, I mentioned before the direct and accelerated attacks on basic workers' rights. I think the initial focus is likely to be on public sector unions, because 1 in 4 union members in the United States is a member of a teachers' union, either the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, or the NEA, the National Education Association. 1 in 4 union members are a member of one of those two teachers' organizations. Those organizations are in the crosshairs. And public education more broadly is in the crosshairs. And with Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education, the risk to public education is grave indeed. The second is what I mentioned before, and that is that leaders in the labor movement could succumb to this viral politics of anger and resentment. That again would make them more risk averse and afraid to embrace the fights of those people who are most vulnerable in the age of Trump, whether they're immigrant workers, people of color, women, etc., and make these labor leaders more narrow in their focus. And this, I think, would isolate labor further from potential allies that the labor movement needs during the age of Trump. And then finally, as I mentioned before, I think that there is a very real risk of a split in the labor movement, and I'd like to explore this a little bit more, based, one, on how to respond to Trump. There's no agreement within the labor movement about how to think about and respond to Trump. And then there are also other underlying differences in the labor movement that are likely to split the House of Labor wide open. But again, of course, there are opportunities. As I said before, connecting labor's necessarily defensive fights to the broader resistance movement that we see, I think could help build a very powerful alliance of social forces that are determined to protect civil society, which is under attack with this authoritarian regime. And by civil society, I mean anything that's not a corporation and the government. I mean trade unions, I mean public education, I mean other organizations that people create in their communities, the free press. These are all at grave risk, I think, with what I would argue is clearly an authoritarian regime that's taken power. The second opportunity is to articulate an expansive vision that redefines and restores and reclaims the American dream as a unifying aspiration. That would be a broader way that the labor movement could talk more directly and specifically to the legitimate concerns and needs of workers who I think, frankly, in this country are searching for answers. And they're searching for answers because working people in this country face more insecurity and less justice every day of their lives. I don't think they're going to get either answers to either of those challenges from this administration. And then finally, the possibility of catching a movement wave, that this resistance could become the next major social movement. There are millions of people who have been energized by this election that are out in the streets. And it could be the early stages of a movement like the civil rights movement or the anti-war movement. And depending on labor's relationship to that movement, it could be an opportunity for growth and a dynamic revitalization. So let me say, it remains an open question as to whether or not the labor movement can deal with these challenges and whether or not the labor movement will effectively identify and seize the opportunities of this moment. I hope the labor movement will be able to meet the challenges of this moment. I hope the labor movement will work to restore the American dream. I hope that the labor movement will play a critical role in protecting and preserving the traditions and institutions of democracy that, as I said before, I believe are under assault today. And if they do, that would be historic. Thank you very much. So let me open it up for questions, comments. Have you got anything that I shared with you or any other questions or thoughts that you have about the labor movement? Yeah.
The labor movement was traditionally known as having a lot of political power. And I'm wondering now that certain sectors are becoming very politicized in terms of how to take Washington back, midterm elections, etc. What opportunities do you see for the labor movement? Now that you can pay for any election, nobody even knows who's paying for these ads because of Citizens United. In a bizarre way, there may be an opportunity for the labor movement to have more political influence than they used to.
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. And there's a few things I'd say about it. The first is that the labor movement will never have sufficient resources to outspend its adversaries. And so while the labor movement spends enormous amounts of money on politics, and the question is not can the labor movement spend more money than this dark money, but if the labor movement uses its money more effectively. So I would say that the labor movement for too long has pursued a failed political strategy. It's a strategy that involves allowing candidates to come to the labor movement for their support, and if they get elected, they betray the labor movements and working people's interests once they're in office. Which is more common in years, supporting candidates who end up losing. And here's the problem in my mind with that. In 2014, in the midterms in 2014, the labor movement spent $900 million. $800 or $900 million. How was that money spent? It was spent on dropping staff into battleground districts and fighting to elect particular candidates, right? And then after the election, pulling them out, right? It was the expenditure of almost $1 billion that the labor movement got nothing for. Now, at the same time the labor movement was doing that, there were 5 or 6 electoral campaigns, not for candidates, but for issues like raising the minimum wage, all of which passed. And in some very unlikely places like Arkansas, South Dakota, okay? What if the labor movement spent half of that $800 million? No, not half, a quarter, 10%.
10% of that $800 million on building capacity in red states or in red areas in blue states like upstate New York. Not just for a candidate, but to actually build a political operation to engage workers around issues that matter to workers that are not tied to a particular candidate. What if the labor movement pursued and used those resources on a political strategy that tried to shape the public debate around critical questions impacting working people, and that candidates could get our support if they supported our issues? That's a fundamentally different way than the way the labor movement has approached politics. So I don't think it's a question of how much money is spent, but how the money is spent. And in 2014, everything I just said applies to the greater force of 2016. In 2014, there was a referendum in a city that's kind of like a suburb of Atlanta. This is like actually relevant to the earlier conversation we had to do with transportation, where working people in the suburb could not, they were spending 2 hours getting to work because there was no public transit that serviced this poor working class and largely community of color. And so they had a referendum to increase the sales tax in order to fund the extension of public transit to this community. All right? Every Democrat lost in Georgia. This referendum won by 75%. People voted to tax themselves. It completely runs counter to our idea that people are against taxes, as opposed to, there's actually a critical role that the government can play if it's well-resourced to meet the needs we have. So I think that's a great question about politics. I think that if the labor movement is going to revitalize its fortunes, it's going to require a more innovative and longer-term view of politics. One last point about this, and then I'll come down, won't forget it, which is we have experienced a shift in the political center of gravity to the right. And that's not the consequence of a single election. That's the consequence of a strategy that was developed decades ago. It's a 30 or 40-year strategy to move the center of gravity to the right. And the Republican Party and conservatives, well-financed by dark money, have pursued this strategy with a tremendous amount of discipline and patience. And they have been largely successful. And I think it's going to require not just the labor movement, but the broader political system in this country to think beyond the next electoral cycle. Longer term, where do we want to be as a society in 10, 20, and 30 years? What's our vision for the kind of society we're creating? What do we need to do politically and in other activities? Yeah, you waited very patiently.
Yeah, I'd like to hear you expound on your last example that, here the issue got approved, but the candidate, the Democrat who may have espoused that issue did not get elected. So where's the disconnect where the voter is not voting for the candidate who's pushing for those very issues?
Okay.
Why isn't he getting elected?
Yeah. So are you asking that question in general or
Yeah.
in particular?
Well, in that particular example, but in general, in terms of the strategy that you're expressing as might be more successful for the labor movement to be more issue-oriented in terms of putting money into that from the labor movement to push the cause as opposed to supporting candidates per se.
Yeah.
Why can't you draw the connection between the candidate and the issue and get that candidate elected?
Yeah, I should clarify what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that these are mutually exclusive or that it doesn't matter who the candidate is, but there are places in this country where the labor movement has a very disciplined process of endorsements, where they insist that candidates come and learn the issues that the labor movement is fighting for, and those candidates who embrace those issues get full-throated support from the labor movement. What unfortunately happens in many places is that the labor movement endorses 35 candidates, and its endorsement is of little consequence to those candidates. Whereas in places where they're focused on particular issues, they're much more selective and strategic in saying, yeah, there's 15 races, but we're going to invest in these 5, because these are candidates who are true champions of the working class. And therefore, we will intervene in a way that's potentially decisive. That actually is a much better way to spend resources by focusing them and then having an impact. So I think the candidates are not unimportant, and I didn't mean to suggest that. I just mean that they're not, the strategy is not sufficiently tied to issues. And oftentimes those issues can cut across party lines. So it's a way to begin to overcome the kind of partisanship where people often are making decisions about who they vote for not in a deliberative process about what that candidate really stands for, but on some more deeply emotional resonance that they feel with that candidate, which I think is very much the case with Trump. Now, let me, if I may, I just want to say, like, apply this in particular to the presidential election. Okay, I mean, first of all, Trump, you know, if you've like watched his speeches during the campaign, many of the things that he was saying were exactly the same things that the labor movement had been saying to their members for years. These trade deals are a ripoff. NAFTA has resulted in significant job losses. There's not enough attention being paid to job retention and growth in this country. The insurance industries are ripping us off. The pharmaceuticals are ripping us off. The political system is rigged. It's like his rhetoric was actually quite consistent with the rhetoric of the labor movement. I mean, it's hard to know if he believes in anything besides Donald Trump, but he had the rhetoric. And that resonated, I think, with a significant fraction of the electorate. And on the other hand, you had Hillary Clinton running, who was the quintessential status quo candidate. So in an election where people have endured wage stagnation, job loss, growing insecurity, accelerated by the crash of 2008, this is an election where people want change. And Hillary Clinton symbolically didn't represent that, even though, as a matter of policy, the things that she would have done would have been much better for the working people who ended up voting for Trump. And it wasn't a majority, let's be clear, but it was a significant fraction, including a significant fraction of union members who were swept up in that fake populism. And I mean, just stop it. It's, you know, I don't know like how explicit I should be. It's friggin' despicable to see like the things that he's doing as president and how fundamentally different they are from this populist rhetoric. Not the least of which is the cabinet. Just like look at the cabinet. Wall Street's taken over because they didn't drain the swamp. They like open the doors, bring them in. Yeah.
Okay, so Joe, I have two questions. So I guess the context of the current labor density, the union density,
It's about, it's just under 11%. It's the economy, but in the private sector, it's like 6.9%. And that's an improvement back to the relation between private sector and public sector density. Maybe the hard to answer yet.
All right, so the first question goes back to Trump because I'm just talking about unionized labor here. So whether it's 11 or 6 or 7, depending on the sector. So Trump is quotation that you started with, as I read it, was speaking to internal sort of internal union governance process, or at least that he's got me thinking about that. Because one of the criticisms, of course, of a lot of unions is that they don't have adequate internal democratic process. So I'm wondering whether that's what Trump meant, if that's part of the problem, and what some of the efforts are to solve that problem, to make unions internally more democratic, become organizations that more people would see as, oh, that's the place where I can have my concerns addressed in a democratic manner. So that's one question. And the other is, just, you know, not this one, but we know SEIU, progressive, electrical workers, progressive, and so on. But can you kind of give us a rough sense about, like, currently, what's going on? I mean, which unions are still drinking the Kool-Aid, and which ones are throwing it out?
Good. So on the first question, I think that Trump was not referring to internal union politics and dynamics, but workplace representation. That is, to what extent do unions effectively represent workers in their workplaces? All right. And I think his point was that, which is kind of the point I was trying to make, that on the one hand, unions are becoming less effective at representing their current members because those current members represent a shrinking share of the economy, and therefore the places where they work are faced with downward pressure on their wages, and the unions aren't strong enough to resist that downward pressure. So, you know, like any way that you measure how effective is the union, are you winning a better contract, are you getting higher wages? Unions have been in a defensive posture for, you know, like several decades, where they're just trying to hold on to what they have. But your question about internal the internal democratic life of union, I think is a really good question. And I think the election in some ways, more than Trumka's quote, raises that question. Because one of the things that many union leaders are thinking now is, wow, like if you look at union member political behavior, over the last 40 or 50 years, roughly 40% of union members vote for Republicans. Like the union membership is not homogenous by any means when it comes to politics. A significant fraction will vote for the Republican candidate. But in this particular election, there are a number of unions where a majority of their members voted for Trump. And what that raised for some union members as well, we are out of touch with our members. And that may create an opportunity, and many of them are thinking about this stuff, we need to reimagine our relationship with our members. And we need to think much more about how we can get our members connected and engaged. And I think increasing the democratic spirit of the union, make it easier for people to participate in union affairs, is one of the ways to deal with this particular threat. So I think there's an opportunity there. There's more to be said for like how to make unions more appealing to workers who are outside of the unions, including, interestingly, young people. And I don't know how you define that category, but under 35, there's a very favorable view of unions among 35, among that cohort, except that there's a question of like, do we actually fit in these organizations? And there's a tendency, I would say, within unions, unfortunately, for veteran leaders to say, well, we just educate these young people about how good unions are and then let them join. As opposed to, we need to like think how we are structured and what we offer that's actually relevant to the next generation. And I can talk a little bit about that. But I want to get to the second question. And that is where unions are at now. So let me answer that by stepping back and looking at this administration and return to something that I said in my presentation but didn't elaborate. And that is this an authoritarian regime? Have we crossed some line in our politics? This is not just, wow, how did this guy get elected? This is something fundamentally different than we've experienced before. And some would argue, including a friend who studies authoritarian regimes around the world, says that if you look at this, if you look at the Trump administration, he is following the authoritarian playbook pretty damn closely, including things like one, presenting myself as I'm the only one who can solve the problem, to trying to appropriate power and diminish the power of other branches of government, to demonizing the free press. Like, I've never been like a huge CNN fan, but we got to be out there demonstrating in front of CNN to support the media, because this is part of a predetermined attack on the essential elements of civil society. So, to your question, I don't think that the labor movement has figured out how should we respond to this. And one of the things that this friend of mine named Charlotte has done in her studies of the responses of labor movements to authoritarian regimes around the world is that they have a few different choices. Like, one choice is to just, like, stick your head in the sand, like, lay low. Maybe, it'll be like a period of chaos, but then we'll pass through this and we'll be okay. And another response is, well, maybe we can accommodate this authoritarian regime. We should meet with them, we should talk with them, we should appropriate their language. We should say, yeah, we're on the same side, we can work together. And then there are others who say, no, the only way to resist an authoritarian regime is to resist an authoritarian regime. Those are a set of lines that are dividing the labor movement at the moment. And one of the key playbooks of authoritarian regimes is to pick winners and losers in civil society. So it's like, if you take a look at Trump's speeches during the campaign, he never openly attacked unions in his speeches. And after he came into office, he invited into the Oval Office a group of union leaders picking the winners. These were building trades union leaders, apropos of our discussion earlier, all right? To bring them into the White House. And this is part of like how you pick winners and losers to split the labor movement. So some people are saying, yeah, we can work with this guy. And others are saying, we have to openly resist. And I think it's an open question about how people respond. And for me personally, that was a really disheartening moment. And let me be clear, like, I've been around for a little bit of a while. I understand that, you go meet with the president. It's not like the meeting with the president that was a concern. It's like these guys coming out of the meeting gushing over it, and saying, this is a new day for the American working class. You just think like, oh my God, Trump and his team must be like knocking down the martinis in Mar-a-Lago or wherever it is that they're spending all our money. And just saying like, this is like shooting fish in a barrel, how easy the labor movement is. So the answer to your question is, we don't know yet how unions will respond. And I think it's going to be how clever the administration is in maintaining the winners. But what's true about authoritarian regimes around the world is that those winners end up being losers at a certain point after all of the other losers have been knocked off. So it's a delicate and dangerous dance, I think. This is a moment, man, different than anything, I think, than anything that we've experienced. Can you remember your question? So I'm just kind of curious, if I may, like, does this resonate with you, or do you think, like, you're just like 2 years, like worrying too much about our democratic traditions and institutions? Like, we can withstand this. This is not like that we've crossed some threshold into. Like, how do you guys see this moment? Yeah. Can you remember your question? Sure. Okay.
My mom's president of her teachers union, so this definitely resonates. It's something I hear at home, and something I'm definitely conscious about for when I come out of college, which will be after the 4-year period of Trump's administration, and kind of like where I would play to the working class.
Yeah. And how much damage could be done?
Yeah.
Will be done by them. In particular, in relation to one area. Where's your mom president?
Well, for us, Central Schools, it's in Portland County.
Yeah.
I think I met her.
Really?
Did she go to the march?
Yeah, she was an activist.
Yeah, she came right over to me, started talking about, she got my sign, she's putting it up in a wall, the 10 signs of picking fashion.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's great. Great. Yeah. Well, I'm the son and father of teachers, and my mom, who's 95 years old, is still super active in her retiree group. Yeah, if you're a teacher working in public education, you got a target on your back. I'm scary. Anybody else on that? I mean, I'm just curious. Does it sound like, oh man, we like heard this speaker like crazy, but yeah.
Yeah, similar to her, my dad's a single dad in the future, so kind of just worried about like what's gonna be like when I come out of college, and, like how he's gonna be like.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so there's discussion on the left, except the far left, that the election of Trump, right, does signify something kind of unique, right, as you're suggesting. And in some ways, there's something, right, it's that crisis of opportunity bit, right? If Trump is something so exceptional, maybe we went out for something exceptional on the left, right, rather than just resisting, or even framework, right, protecting these ideals of liberal democracy, right? What if we go beyond that, right? What if the election of Trump simply just puts in, stark relief how corrupt our democratic institutions have always been, right? So that's a different perspective on it, right? What if this is an opportunity to really reevaluate not only, again, sadly, capitalism in general, right, but also these sort of really celebrated and kind of idealized systems of our government, right? The White House is the thing where presidential things happen, we must bow down to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I say like a moment of opportunity, my thinking is that it's a time not to become more narrow, become more broad and more visionary in terms of what kind of society we're trying to build. And I think people are searching for that, including people who voted for Trump, right? Like they feel like this is not working, something is wrong. If you don't know quite what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? And someone needs to like be out there saying, here's a way to reorganize things that could actually work. That's a little bit what I mean by not just restoring the American dream, but redefining the American dream in some broad, broad and inspiring kind of vision. I think that's a great opportunity. But the flip side of that, you were waiting so patiently on this, but the flip side of that is, like there are millions of people who have been energized. I don't think we can underestimate how significant that is. The number of people, and they are unlikely suspects. It's like not people that you necessarily see out there organizing and mobilizing because they've been so, inspired to act at this particular moment. And I think that, as someone that comes out of the labor movement, one of my deepest concerns is where are we? Like when you go to these demonstrations, do you see the unions there? And I think that if the unions can join this emerging resistance movement, as I suggested, it's an opportunity to potentially build a much more powerful movement. However, if too many unions, coming back to your question, end up with like, let's not rock the boat too much, let's not really challenge this president, let's not fully, in a full-throated way join this resistance, I think the labor movement runs the risk of losing a generation of activists who are out in the streets ready to do something, and they're looking to see who's going to be there. And I think that would be a tremendous loss, and that's something that's uneven around the country. So the national AFL-CIO has been a little ambivalent about how to respond. But it's very geographically based. There are 20 or 30 cities where the central labor councils of those cities are leading the resistance. And I run a number of leadership development programs, and the leader of the labor movement in Sacramento, right, said there are 42 indivisible groups in Sacramento. 42. And he has met with every one of them. He's like dropping everything else he's doing, and he's like going out to engage with the resistance because the labor movement has resources, the labor movement has members, the labor movement has expertise and experience in organizing and mobilizing. Where will the labor movement be at this point? I think it's like a watershed moment. Okay, how much more can I ask you? You've been so patient.
I was going to ask about the education. So we were talking about parents being unions. But I grew up in New York City, and being in a lot of public schools, I saw like, all these union leaders who were like, pretty much shouldn't have been there, but they were getting fired. And especially like most of them were white teachers in this like multicultural communities, low income communities. And I think that's why a lot of charter schools started to come up in like my neighborhood, New York City, because these teachers were just failing and they couldn't get rid of them. So I don't understand. I'm wondering what is really bad about kind of being a little harsher on these unions in schools when they're honestly failing.
Okay, that's a good and fair question. And here's a couple of thoughts about that. So one, I'm not. I started out saying this is a system that is not working, and these are unions that are spending billions of dollars, and it's it's inaccessible to people, it's irrelevant to people, and in some cases it's really counterproductive. So I recognize that there are weaknesses in unions. I don't think that there's an epidemic of bad teachers. I think that is the rhetoric on the right. We're to create a feeling of like, oh my God, this is a crisis, we've got to get rid of these unions. In fact, that's why they're developing that narrative that there is an epidemic of bad teachers. Which is not to say that the teachers' unions have often made the mistake of defending teachers and keeping them in the classroom when they should be someplace else, out of the classroom. And that has not been good for the kids, not been good for public education, not been good for the teachers. And I think that the unions are trying to reposition themselves around those kind of questions. What's important is that the union has the experience of teachers being fired arbitrarily by principals who have too much power, and they just don't like someone and they get rid of them. And so fighting for due process for those teachers is important. What's the right balance to strike? And I think that's an important question. I would say that both the American Federation of Teachers, which is the union, that's what the UFT is in New York, where you're from, and the National Education Association, is paying very close attention to this kind of question and is fighting, for a vision of public education that's quality public education for everyone. And there's no place where that's more true than in Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union, which is a very dynamic organization, new leadership. And it's not just fighting to protect teachers, but it's fighting for racial and economic justice in the city of Chicago in ways that when Rahm Emanuel was running for re-election as mayor, the president of the Teachers Union, Karen Lewis, was considering a run against him, and she was polling ahead of him. She had to pull out of the election because she ended up with a brain tumor. But the support that the Teachers Union had among black and brown communities was so powerful because they had aligned themselves with the interests of those communities. So it is not like one story that covers everyone, but I would be very cautious about these kind of narratives that make it sound like, wow, we gotta get rid of these unions, because that's actually the purpose of the narrative. Yeah. Anyway, any other questions or comments? Yeah, I want to be mindful of your time.
I wonder if you could sort of, you've already talked a bit about this, but expand about the labor movement's relationship with the Democratic Party. I mean, you've been talking about how you've spent so much money on Democratic Party candidates. You could say overall the last couple of decades, the Democratic Party's kind of taken those union voters for granted, sort of because they don't have many other places to go. Well, that kind of changed in 2016, and so, and interesting, like in the primary, Democratic primary, a lot of the major unions came out for Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders. So, where you might expect Bernie Sanders being sort of the working class type candidate. So, is this relationship broken with the unions and the Democratic? What can they do to make the Democratic Party listen to working class interests for voters?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I would definitely say that it is a relationship that is fairly dysfunctional. And I think that this actually speaks to your question about internal union democracy. That there were a lot of rank and file union members who were really disaffected by the process of endorsing Hillary without really fully vetting that process with union members. And during the election, I had a friend who was running a union political operation in the state of Wisconsin. She said, we're having a hell of a time getting our union members to really participate in this election because they're still pissed off at the way in which Hillary's nomination was secured with union support at the top. And it reinforced, I think, for many rank and file members that the system is rigged and the labor movement is part of the system, But the short answer to that question is I think that the labor movement and other progressive forces should take over the Democratic Party. I mean, Trump just showed you how you do it with the Republican Party. So, but that's a short and too simple answer to a good and complicated question. Yeah.
I kind of want to be a speechwriter when I grow up, so I pay attention to the stories people try to sell and what politicians try to sell. And it seems like the Republicans just have a better idea of what white men want, or what rural. They've captured white men's attention with their story of producerism and a lower class that's trying to eat away at their earnings, and a upper class that's trying to push down on them from above. And the Democrats haven't proposed an alternative, for what a man's supposed to be. It's a question of masculinity.
There's been a lot written about that, in particular in relation to Trump, and the ways in which he kind of symbolizes and reinforces this story that this is what masculinity is.
Yeah.
On the general point, I think that you're right, that the Republicans have been more clever and more effective in the messaging that speaks to people at a gut level. The problem, I think, the problem with many Democrats and the problem with me is that I actually think people are persuaded by rational arguments. And that's not really how people behave. There's been a lot of really great work done on how the mind works, including in relation to politics. The political brain, the political mind, most recently it's political animals. And it essentially points out that people do not engage in a deep deliberative process, really analyzing what are the issues, what are the concerns. It's not about how I feel, how they make me feel. And I think that Trump's message particularly, I think, resonated with white men who feel displaced by globalization and feel like somebody, that's the usurpation anxiety syndrome that I was talking about. And he sort of spoke to that. That's why I think Make America Great Again was so resonant with those people. Now, I personally think that we shouldn't write anybody off. Like, except for the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party, we should try to get in conversation with people and like figure out what they think and why they think it. Because I think a significant fraction of Trump voters had very understandable and legitimate anxieties about the world they're in. And the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton didn't offer them, a message. I'm getting a little bit away from your point, but speaking particularly to white men. I mean, I guess one solution would be to just eliminate the right to vote for white men. Transform this country to be like a bunch of. I'm willing to give up the right to vote for that. I'm just kidding. Uh-oh, that was a violation.
I think that the political power narrative is really important, and that's fuel of politics. Another fuel are promises and delivery on promises, and failing to deliver, for 2 months, 6 months, a year. I mean, there's always going to be that core of true believers, but part of the way that politics works are that second run of those who actually believe in the promises start shearing off. So I'm with you, but I think that politics includes actual, if you want to call, I don't think we call that rationality, it's reciprocity. It's like, this is what you're promising. At some point, delivery is an important part of the reciprocal relationship.
Yeah.
So,
I
the special elections are really significant, it seems to me, for what's happening already, shearing off that second.
Today's the election in Georgia, right?
Right.
Has anyone heard what's happening with that?
Just the polls are looking like.
Tight.
Tight.
Well, but I really appreciate what you're saying. That's right. And some of it requires kind of an analysis of the electorate. Like some, there are ways in which like Trump utters a phrase with extreme vetting. Like you watch the interview where he's like, pull it out of like nowhere. Then it sort of comes to some kind of policy. But there are other things that he says that are like dead on. That are like, whoa, he's really speaking to the issue. And so when he said, I can stand out on Fifth Avenue and I can shoot somebody and my supporters wouldn't abandon me. Like he was actually right about some fraction of his supporters where even when the promises are, and they're not being met, even when they're not being met, they'll make up excuses for it. But what about the other fractions of Trump voters who are going to become disaffected and disillusioned and are going to say, like, he didn't deliver his promises? And that's why I think we need to engage. We need to reach out. But I do think that we sometimes put more stock in the rational process than evidence suggests shapes political behavior in this country. Anyway, well, this is like totally fun to talk about this. I don't know if it seems relevant to you all in your lives, but I would like go back to the core of what I was saying, which is we have a problem of inequality and growing inequality, and it is the result of declining unionization among other factors. And whether or not the labor movement responds to this problem, we can actually both restore, redefine the country, and also revitalize the labor movement. Depends some on what labor leaders do, but I also think depends some on what you and your generation do as you're coming out of college and becoming active citizens, responding to a world that I think is going to be increasingly menacing, and my generation sure has to fix it. So I hope like yours can.
And on that inspirational note,